now ask Brian Denny for the second time to speak about social Europe and other matters which are of concern to the labour and trade union movement in particular. Brian.
Thanks, Chair. Well, it's nice to be here amongst friends. It's nice to be the third speaker because the first two speakers made my job a whole lot easier. In terms of talking about democracy and the progressive case against what the EU is doing, and then Horst, of course, who highlighted the role of German imperialism in all this, and Horst, you're certainly not an ugly German. I don't think anyone in this room thinks you are. I'll be speaking about the state of the labour movement and the democratic movement and the case for getting out in the trade union and labour movement. Since the Tory party won the election, in my opinion, on the basis of saying, giving the British people the chance to vote, and the Labour Party had a suicidal position of being against that, and that's why we've got a Tory government with a 24% Europhile Tory government at the moment, because of that. Since then, Leave groups have got together and they've talked about discussions, and it's quite clear, every analysis that I've heard is that if the labour movement doesn't vote to leave, we're going to lose this referendum. There's 6 million trade unionists in this country, and if they don't mobilise and if they don't vote the right way, then we're going to be staying in. And that's generally, I haven't spoken to anyone who doesn't think that's not the case. The campaign against Eurofederalism has fought a hard battle for over many, many years, decades even, in a very hostile environment. Bob Crow obviously set up No 2U to start that process way back in 2009, and now the trade unions against the EU have launched themselves, and we're getting a lot of traction, got a lot of interest within the TUC. We had a packed fringe meeting, and we only had water on offer rather lots today, so it was interesting that people bothered to get out of conference, walk all the way over to the Ship Hotel and listen to us. We've never had that before, and so things are changing. So I want to talk about, my comments is about why is the labour movement largely absent from this debate at the moment. Even I work for the RMT, and by a happy coincidence, the RMT is the only union with a policy of withdrawal from the European Union. But we are the only union, even though we have friends in other unions, and because the debate hasn't been had within the trade union movement on that issue, and I think that's deliberate. Many trade unionists believe that the European Union is even a socialist project, or even at best, at worst, a social democratic project, whereas we all know that the EU is a Tory project, it always has been. But the problem for us is that Tory Eurosceptics often use the arguments used by Europhiles in the labour movement to say how bad Europe is. In other words, the Tory Eurosceptics often say it's a socialist plot designed to bring socialism and full employment and workers' rights, and we don't want that. And so that very debilitating narrative has been very difficult for us to break through and actually talk about the illusion. And as long as the illusion is maintained that the EU is some sort of social democratic institution, then we're not going to progress. But I think that is breaking down. But we're going to have to ask our friends from other political traditions to stop saying that this is a socialist project and talk about the corporate nature of the EU. It's just very debilitating. It's always been difficult because back in John Major's day when he was pushing through the Maastricht Treaty, it was seen as the bastards and all the rest of it that was stopping the progress of the European empire. And I think it's worth going back and looking over a little bit of history, not just because I'm sure everyone in this room understands what I'm talking about, but out there, that narrative is not getting as much traction as it should, particularly within the trade union and labour movement. The Tory policy probably changed somewhere around Suez 1957, the collapse of the confidence in British imperialism, and they moved towards the German and French powers in which to project their power around the world. And that was a switch that was finally ingrained when Teddy took Britain in 1973, and then Thatcher campaigned to keep us in 75, and in 79 then she implemented a whole raft of issues that came out of the Treaty of Rome in 1957. Primarily in 1979 the free movement of capital was introduced, and then in 1983 the European Roundtable of Industrialists was founded. They've still got their website. They virtually wrote all the treaties, and the first treaty was the Single European Act, which drew up plans for the complete free movement of services and goods within the EU. And Margaret Thatcher was a very, very enthusiastic sponsor of this, with Lord Cockfield on the Commission and Margaret Thatcher in Britain. And a young John Bercow was actually a researcher in all that process. He actually worked on the Single European Acts. And he said, this is a quote now, "Margaret Thatcher herself was a driving force behind the Act, and some of her ministers positively fizzed with enthusiasm about the single market, which they believe achieved the Thatcherisation of Europe." I mean, that's something worth thinking about in terms of where we are now. And then she moved towards shutting down the steel industries, the coal industries, and moving towards the deindustrialisation of Britain. So Margaret Thatcher wasn't the best person to sell the euro to the Labour movement at that point. You can imagine a very polarised society after the miners' strike, and the Labour movement had a lot of hostility towards the Tory Europhile establishment, of course, and that was pretty entrenched by then. But of course, corporate Europe can project itself as anything. It can be as right-wing as you like, it can be as left-wing as you like, and use any rhetoric it can in order to sell its products, and that's what it does. It's selling its products, which is obviously corporate empire, and they're very good at marketing themselves. And the whole social Europe agenda was actually a marketing exercise from the beginning, because they recognised that Thatcher wouldn't be the one to sell the euro to trade unionists. So we had Jacques Delors came to the TUC in 1988, a very demoralised trade union movement, and he made an infamous speech, and he said, if British trade unionists, and I think it was the same in Denmark as well, although I'm not au fait with that, if trade unionists supported the completion of the single market and supported Euro membership, it would deliver a social model compatible to trade union aspirations of full employment and workers' rights and improvement of the weather. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is, but it's just selling a product, right? So this was a completely unfounded mantra. It had no kind of base, like most marketing. It had no base in reality. It was just a marketing exercise. And a campaign against Eurofederalism actually produced this pamphlet, which is a collection of essays from over the years trying to expose that, called Social Europe is a Con. And one of the people that was at that conference was Bob Crow, as a young man, and he was shocked to see an entire generation of trade union officials kind of sort of body snatched, and they just switched and said, the euro is going to give us everything. And it was quite convenient, because then they don't have to do anything but just go to Brussels and come back. And social partnership and the whole rhetoric, which is what all it was the idea that socialism has moved to a higher level, and that it's going to move into relentlessly move towards a more fairer society. Bob Crow thought it was extraordinary at the time, because he thought, without any class struggle, we've won. Is that right? Is that what's happened? We've won. It's all over, is it? And they actually ignored him, and he was actually ostracised, and they tried hard to keep him off the General Council, because he just sat there and said the Emperor has new clothes, and he said it over and over again. And he was very resented by it. And the TUC is still saying we're going to move towards a better world through the institutions of the European Union. And then another example of that is actually the ERT itself, which actually wrote the Single European Act and all the other treaties, and a Secretary General called Keith Richardson. It really did was so mendacious, and he actually honestly explained why the social chapter was useful and the idea of social Europe was useful. And I'll just read this quote out. I won't read many quotes out. If politicians feel it is important to get the chapter referring to the desirability of full employment, and they think it will help public opinion, we don't really object, providing, of course, that it remains related to aspirations. In other words, it's just a lie. Okay? And he's openly saying it's a lie, and we don't care, because it's a way of selling the ideas to 8 million trade unions at the time. And it got even weirder, because then by '89 the Berlin Wall came down, and Margaret Thatcher changed her mind, and she famously went to Bruges and made her speech and said she didn't actually like the EU, even though she spent her whole life constructing the whole thing. And then Dennis Skinner famously said Margaret Thatcher was kicked out like a dog in the night, and they brought in John Major, one of the most EU fanatical prime ministers this country has ever seen. Very hostile to democratic politics, and very into the idea of promoting EU directives as a way forward. Interestingly, he actually used an EU directive to privatise the railways in EU Directive 91440 in 1994, something that Margaret Thatcher was also refused to do. And so he was in front of the curve in terms of being far to the right of Margaret Thatcher. And yet, of course, there's an ideological collapse inside the Labour Party, and Kinnock and then our friend Tony Blair became sort of power Tories that went along with the whole project from then onwards, and that brings us up to where we are today. So it was a perfect storm, really, because you had this idea of the British establishment coming together against these horrible Eurosceptic Tories, and all the time they were imposing very, very right-wing policies, not just in Britain, but across the European Union. And the European TUC today, which weirdly enough actually campaigned in Greece for a yes vote for more austerity. They actually went to Greece and campaigned for more austerity. They went into a sovereign country and said, you must vote for more austerity. And the Greek people rejected it, but obviously other ways were brought in to sell more austerity to people. So what has happened to social Europe? Well, it hasn't worked, really. I mean, it doesn't really, you know, the problem for the Europhiles in the trade union and labour movement, there is no narrative for them to say it's worked. I mean, Liz Kendall was the right-wing Labour candidate, and she said one of her red lines was, we must stay in the European Union. And in one programme I thought, she said, well, why must we do that? Basically, she said, I don't know, really. It's just So, it's been a disaster. Obviously, I mean, we can talk about the number of unemployment. I mean, it is just a mess across the European Union. I mean, unemployment is ballooning everywhere, and suicide rates in Greece are over 40,000 a year, and it's just, it goes on and on. I won't dwell on that too much, but the interesting thing about, for us, is agency workers. And what the EU is doing is imposing agency workers onto the workforce. There are over 1 million agency workers in this country today, and they've done that by using a thing called the Agency Workers Directive, which actually enforces agency work and gets rid of permanent jobs in favour of zero-hour contracts. And it's actually a policy of the EU to do that. And it's also abolishing collective bargaining as a concept. In Romania, before it had a bailout, there was 98% coverage of collective bargaining. Now it's about 20%. Catastrophic decline in collective bargaining. Where there's no collective bargaining, there's a catastrophic decline in wages. And that's why people are fleeing those countries and moving somewhere else to where wages are higher. So it is actually an EU policy. And when you talk to Polly Toynbees and the lefties that love, and the lovies that love the EU so much, and you talk to them about the Agency Workers Directive, they insist it's a good thing because it defends agency workers. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. It only kicks in after 12 weeks. And there's actually a thing called the Swedish derogation, in which if the agency worker declares himself as self-employed directly by the agency, then the agency directive doesn't cover them and they can get paid lower rates of pay. We have cleaners on South West trains who come into our office and say, I've been Swedish derogated. And these are not well-educated people. They don't understand what the Swedish derogation is. You talk to Polly Toynbee and any Guardianista, they've never heard of it, and they're not interested because it doesn't fit the fake narrative that's been rammed down people's throats. And people don't know, and you can't blame people for for falling for it, really. And so the whole thing is a whole litany of criminal attacks on workers' rights, and that's not enough. There's the European Court of Justice has made a number of rulings saying, for instance, in the Laval case, Swedish building workers were on a building site and they brought in Latvians, paying them a third of the pay. So they blockaded the site and said, you can't do that. We've got a national agreement. We're defending our national agreement that's been agreed at a national level. So they went to a court. And the European Court of Justice said Laval has the right to employ Latvians on a third of the wages, and your national agreement is worth nothing. So it's in a process called social dumping. They're smashing wage rates across the European Union, because once it's in on the statute book, then any other trade union trying to block social dumping is outside of the law. British Airways pilots tried to do it, and they said if you do it, your trade union will cease to exist because we'll take all your money. And so they just had to abandon the case, and now they're being socially dumped. And you can put that across any number of industries. So what's happening because of the free movement of labour? Obviously, social dumping is endemic. Migrant labour is rapidly moving west, while capital and manufacturing is moving east, to the benefit of no one except for corporate capital. And Western European countries are experiencing a massive influx and all the pressure on public services that you'll probably all know about. But more actually, the brain drain in Eastern Europe is devastating. In Latvia, a third of the population have disappeared, and they are now working in hotels around here, probably. So that's a devastating effect on the Latvian economy, because all their talent has gone, all their young people has gone, and all they're left with is a future economic underdevelopment in which they're just used as a sort of source of reserve army of labour for corporate capital. It's not very cheery, is it? But the problem is, it's getting worse. There's a thing called the Trade in Services Agreement that the EU is negotiating with 52 nations, in which Mode 4 will be introduced, and it's already happening. Mode 4 is already happening when they bring in very, very well-educated Indian workers, and they bring them in on the minimum wage here to do very, very skilled jobs. John was talking to John the other day, and there's skilled engineers and technicians up and down the country can't work. They can't get any more work because they're being socially dumped not by EU member state citizens, but by third world citizens. And in our industry, we are losing. The British seafaring ratings will disappear in the next 5 years. Shipping owning companies saying we will not employ British seafarers on British ships. And they can say that under the law. Okay, we'll finish that now. So anyway, that's enough of that. But we should turn this referendum into a referendum on corporate globalisation. People don't like it. People don't like TTIP. They don't like TISA. They don't like all the other trade deals. They don't like what's been done to them. But they haven't got a narrative in which to express themselves, and it's fear that's been used against them. So that if they say anything, they're some sort of racist. We have to change that mentality, and we have to fight against corporate power and for national democracy. Thank you very much.